Al Capone. The name probably rings a bell, right? He's widely considered the most notorious gangster in history, a dominant force during Prohibition in the United States throughout the 1920s. The man they called Scarface has certainly left his mark, inspiring countless films, books, and documentaries that shaped our modern stereotype of the mafia. To truly grasp his rise in organized crime and the enduring fascination he holds for so many, let's dive right into the incredible story of his life as a gangster. It's important to note that this account is purely for historical purposes, not an endorsement or glorification of organized crime in any way. Alphonse Gabriel Capone arrived in the world in 1899, right there in Brooklyn, New York. His parents, Italian immigrants, had come to the United States seeking a better future for their children. His father, Gabriel Capone, worked as a barber, while his mother, Teresa, was a seamstress. They did their best to raise their 9 children, battling incredibly tough living conditions. Like so many immigrants of that era, the Capones toiled endlessly to make ends meet. They were law-abiding citizens, striving to integrate into their adopted country. This was despite facing significant linguistic, cultural, and religious barriers. The Brooklyn neighborhood where young Alphonse Capone grew up was incredibly poor. For a 10-year-old boy, delinquency and hardship were simply a way of life there. This environment profoundly shaped his personality, quickly pushing him towards brutality and violence. By age 14, he'd already formed his first crew, the Navy Street Gang, named after his local stomping grounds. He reportedly put it together to stop Irish boys from harassing Italian girls. Establishing himself as the group's natural leader, Capone already showed an innate command that would stick with him his entire life. That same year, he dropped out of school after hitting a teacher. His disciplinary issues and fiery temper effectively cut his education short. At 19, Capone married Mary Coughlin, a young Irish woman he'd met in a bar. The couple would have their one and only child, Albert Francis. At this point, Al Capone's future was murky. Having left school so early, he had little choice but to turn to the streets to support his family. And it was by diving deeper into New York's burgeoning criminal underworld that he sought to do just that. It was while frequenting New York's many bars that he started meeting big names in the mob, thus taking his first steps into organized crime. There, Capone managed to join a new crew, one that included notorious gangsters like Johnny Torrio, Frankie Yale, and Lucky Luciano. With them, Capone learned the ropes and began his ascent in the New York underworld. He began his climb alongside Frankie Yale, who took him under his wing and hired him at his establishment, the Harvard Inn, which served as both a bar and a brothel. Capone's job there was to collect from deadbeats, intimidating them with force if necessary. He also had to keep tabs on the money flowing in from the prostitutes to prevent any embezzlement. The Harvard Inn, it should be noted, wasn't exactly known for its welcoming atmosphere. Fights and killings were indeed commonplace. Bathed in this violent atmosphere, Capone would soon take part in one such incident, forging his legend and earning a nickname that would stick with him forever. As he settled into his new role and gained more respect from his colleagues, Al Capone began working as a bartender at Frankie Yale's place. It was during this time that he received his infamous scar and the moniker that would follow him for the rest of his life, Scarface. The story goes that one night, Capone spotted a girl, started hitting on her, and apparently whispered some rather unsavory things in her ear. Highly offended by his remarks, the girl flat out rejected his advances and went straight to complain to her brother, a gangster named Frank Galluccio. Drunk and enraged, Galluccio then allegedly brandished a bottle opener, aiming to slit Capone's throat. Luckily, he missed his intended target, but Capone still ended up with 2 deep slashes across his cheek. One was particularly pronounced, stretching from his ear all the way to his mouth. Capone himself would never truly accept this scar, trying to hide it for the rest of his life. What he couldn't have known then was that it would become an inseparable part of his legend. It's tough to believe, but Al Capone very nearly wasn't the iconic gangster we know today. After marrying Mary Coughlin, he seemed to be heading in a completely different direction. He increasingly felt the desire to find an honest, respectable job to protect his family. He managed to do just that when he left Frankie Yale's bar and moved to Baltimore. There, he landed a job that helped him develop some serious accounting skills. These were skills that would prove immensely useful during Prohibition, as he managed his millions. Alas, this ordinary life didn't last. On November 14, 1920, his father Gabriel died of a heart attack, forcing Capone back to Brooklyn and his old criminal connections. Capone was dipping his toe back into organized crime, and this time, it was for good. Back in New York, Capone quickly earned a reputation as a ruthless enforcer. It was whispered that he never hesitated to use force, even killing if necessary. Several accounts claim he killed a prostitute suspected of holding out on him, and even murdered a friend who refused to pay a debt at the bar where he worked. His hot-headedness, however, was becoming a liability. Some of his fellow gang members took a dim view of his violent temperament. Frankie Yale and Lucky Luciano, notably, decided it was time to get him out of town for a while. Their leaders hoped this would cool things down and avoid drawing unwanted attention from the law.
Capone's mission: join Johnny Torrio in Chicago.
Torrio, who needed a trusted hand to help with his extensive criminal operations, found the support he needed at precisely the right moment. Al Capone, forced to accept, took $2,000 from Lucky Luciano and boarded the first train to Chicago. The young gangster was about to write the next chapter of his story in a city that would forge his legend. It was 1921, and Prohibition was in full swing. During this era, Americans were forbidden from consuming or manufacturing any kind of alcohol. Into this unusual historical landscape, Al Capone landed in Chicago with his family. Once there, he had one goal: to learn the inner workings of organized crime and climb the ladder. For this, he relied on his new boss and mentor, Johnny Torrio. At the time, Torrio was the perfect person to guide Capone into the upper echelons of criminality. Under Torrio's tutelage, Capone quickly realized he needed to use his brain more if he wanted to move up in the hierarchy. He started out working in low-level brothels and was soon promoted to bartender at one of Torrio's main establishments. Like Frankie Yale's place, it wasn't exactly a welcoming spot for a casual drink. Murders and fights were a regular occurrence. At this bar, Capone proved quite effective and even managed to forge a strong alliance with his boss, Johnny Torrio. At this point, he started making serious money, thanks in large part to alcohol smuggling, prostitution, racketeering, and sports betting, all lucrative ventures for the mob. Things were going great for Torrio and Capone. Their criminal empire was exploding. Brothels and speakeasies were flourishing across Chicago like never before. But that was before William E. Dever became the city's newly elected mayor. Dever arrived determined to put an immediate stop to illegal betting and prohibition violations. This new crackdown led to the closure of many speakeasies, forcing the gangsters to leave Chicago. Capone and Torrio had no choice but to move their operations to the outskirts of the city, in Cicero. Upon arriving in Cicero, Johnny Torrio, the leader of the gang Capone was a part of, set out to transform the city into a hub for alcohol trafficking and illegal sports betting. Their goal was to expand their vice operations while simultaneously seizing control of the city and its infrastructure. But to achieve this, they absolutely needed the Republican candidate, Joseph Z. Clenha, to win the upcoming elections. Otherwise, their criminal activities would be severely disrupted. And so, the taking of Cicero began. The gangsters had to tip the scales in their candidate's favor. To carry out this mission, Al Capone brought in two of his brothers, Frank and Ralph Capone. March 31, 1924, Election Day. Gangsters used fists and guns to intimidate voters. Voters were escorted to the ballot boxes to ensure their ballots bore the name of Joseph Z. Clenha. Shocked, the residents of Cicero were forced to obey the gangsters, under threat of being shot on the spot. Overwhelmed by the escalating situation, honest voters quickly sought help from Judge Edmund K. Uretsky. Aware of the gravity of the problem, he immediately dispatched 70 plainclothes police officers to Cicero. Blended into the crowd, the police rushed into the riots that were now raging. The moment they stepped out of their unmarked vehicle, they saw Frank Capone attempting to pull a gun from his pocket. Believing it was a raid by a rival gang, Al Capone's older brother prepared for the worst. But following this gesture, the police didn't hesitate and shot him in cold blood. Frank Capone was then riddled with bullets until their magazines were empty. His death was particularly brutal and instantaneous. After this tragic incident, chaos continued to reign in Cicero until the polls closed. Fortunately for Capone and Torrio, their efforts hadn't been in vain. Their candidate, Joseph Z. Clenha, was re-elected. This victory signaled the continuation of their criminal expansion. This victory, however, had a bitter taste for Capone, who had seen his brother Frank gunned down in the skirmish. Deeply affected by this loss, Capone would struggle to recover from it for a long time. Less than a month after Cicero's tumultuous elections, Johnny Torrio and Al Capone wasted no time opening a new gambling house that raked in nearly $1.5 million in its first few years, an astronomical sum for the era. Cicero would soon boast over 150 gambling dens after their arrival. All of them serving alcohol in abundance, despite prohibition. Alcohol bootlegging was incredibly prolific at this time. Consequently, Italian-American gangsters weren't the only ones trying to corner the market. Other criminal outfits also wanted a piece of the pie, including the Irish, who had been there long before them. Inevitably, the two clans clashed, vying for a monopoly on alcohol smuggling. This rivalry, bloody to say the least, pitted Italian and Irish gangsters against each other throughout Prohibition. The Irish gang, led by Dino Bagnon, targeted the Italians, who controlled a significant portion of the alcohol trade. Their goal was clear: eliminate Johnny Torrio, their boss, at all costs. They would attempt just that, launching a ruthless raid to assassinate him some time later. Unfortunately for the Irish, the attempt failed, giving Torrio the perfect opportunity for revenge. And he got it on November 10, 1924, roughly 5 months after the previous Irish attack. That day, Dino Bagnon was gunned down in his flower shop, hit with 2 bullets to the chest and 2 to the neck. The murder was carried out by 3 of Torrio's men, Frankie Yale, John Scalise, and Albert Anselmi. With this rival eliminated, Torrio and Capone weren't finished with the Irish mob. They came back with a vengeance. Indeed, 2 other Irish gangsters, Himmy Weiss and Bugs Moran, would give them a serious run for their money. In January 1925, they hatched another plan to assassinate Torrio. It was the Irish clan's umpteenth attempt to take out the head of the Italian outfit. This time, their move almost succeeded. Torrio miraculously survived, coming perilously close to losing his life. After this incident, Torrio declared he was fed up with Chicago's violent madness and retired. He therefore handed the reins to Capone, who was now at the head of operations. Strange as it may seem, Capone didn't orchestrate any immediate revenge for this attempted murder. This was because Capone was already deeply embroiled in another gang war. The one pitting him against the Jenna brothers, a fearsome Sicilian mafia family causing him significant trouble. However, Scarface couldn't afford to ignore the Irish, who now had only one wish: avenge the death of Dino Bagnon. To counter their relentless reprisals, Capone began planning their extermination. Starting with their primary thorn in his side, Himmy Weiss. A team of 5 hitmen was tasked with carrying out the assassination, including Frank Nitti, Anthony Accardo, Frank Diamond, Albert Anselmi, and John Scalise. October 11, 1926. The hit squad prepared for the assassination by scrutinizing Himmy Weiss's movements. For a week, they waited for the opportune moment to take him down, until finally, an opportunity arose. Seeing Himmy Weiss and 3 of his bodyguards emerge from their headquarters, Capone's soldiers massacred him without mercy. Lying on the ground, one of Scarface's most formidable competitors was now out of the picture. Capone then only needed to get rid of Bugs Moran, and the monopoly on Chicago's alcohol trade would be his. In April 1927, Chicago's former mayor, William H. Thompson, was re-elected. This news greatly benefited Capone and his crew, who, after 4 years in exile, could finally return to their former HQ. More inclined to turn a blind eye to organized crime, the new mayor allowed gangsters to expand their territory without interference from the police. At this point, Bugs Moran was the last major obstacle preventing Capone from achieving total control of the alcohol market. Still locked in conflict, the 2 men were fighting an unprecedented war. The killings were rampant, sowing terror in the streets of Chicago. To finally put an end to this brutal war, Al Capone hatched a plan. February 14, 1929, Valentine's Day. While vacationing at his villa in Florida, Capone ordered several of his men to raid one of Bugs Moran's liquor warehouses. Disguised as police officers, the hired killers ordered the 7 people inside the building to line up against the wall. They were relatively confident and followed orders without flinching. For them, it was just an ordinary shakedown that would be settled as usual with a bribe. But this assumption would prove fatal. Without mercy, Capone's soldiers riddled them with bullets, turning Moran's warehouse into a bloodbath. There were no survivors, all 7 died on the spot. But while identifying the bodies, Capone's henchmen realized, to their great astonishment, that Bugs Moran was not among them. He had, in fact, managed to escape after seeing the policeman arrive at the warehouse moments earlier. Having miraculously escaped the Valentine's Day massacre, Bugs Moran was nonetheless deeply affected by the slaughter. It severely impacted his will to continue the battle. Thus, he gradually retreated from large-scale banditry, now resorting to small-time burglaries. His influence waned, and he found himself less and less protected by the police. His career as a gangster came to a definitive end when he was imprisoned for yet another bank robbery. He died in 1957 while serving his sentence. And just like that, Al Capone had finally gotten rid of all his major rivals. Total control over organized crime in Chicago had never seemed closer. From May 16 to 19, 1929, the first ever U.S. Organized Crime Summit took place. The country's top mafia bosses convened in Atlantic City to discuss the future of their illicit businesses. Al Capone also attended, especially to keep an eye out in case anyone tried to plot something behind his back. He was accompanied by several other major underworld figures, such as Lucky Luciano, Meyer Lansky, Frank Costello, Albert Anastasia, and Willie Moretti. The conference's aim was to ease tensions between the various mafia families and thus avoid turf wars that would severely harm their operations. But Capone wasn't exactly viewed favorably at this meeting. He was particularly criticized for attracting far too much newspaper attention since the infamous Valentine's Day massacre. Some mob bosses even thought it best to get rid of him altogether. He was, therefore, advised to lay low for a while. And that's exactly what he did, but in a rather unexpected way. To keep a low profile, Al Capone chose the most radical solution: prison. Indeed, just 16 hours after leaving the Atlantic City conference, Capone managed to arrange with the Philadelphia police to arrest him for carrying a concealed weapon. For him, it was the only way to get under the radar of the FBI, which was beginning to take a serious interest in him. He was therefore sentenced to 1 year in prison, a relatively light and largely reduced sentence, thanks in particular to his numerous lawyers. Upon his return, Al Capone delegated operations to Ralph, his other older brother who had helped him, among other things, to take Cicero. Once the sentence was served, Capone expected to be back in business as usual. Well, not really. The Valentine's Day massacre had definitively put him on the map in the eyes of the general public, who no longer saw him in the same light. Al Capone tried his best to maintain his public image, notably through various media appearances where he could be seen indulging in his hobbies. Indeed, the Chicago Godfather was a huge sports enthusiast. He loved attending major sporting events, such as boxing matches, baseball games, horse races, and dog races. At these events, it wasn't uncommon to see him accompanied by politicians, who at the time had no shame in publicly associating with him. In his spare time, Capone also attended theater and opera performances. Jazz, poker, and swimming were among his other pastimes. Exposing himself to the media was something he did exceptionally well. This unprecedented level of public exposure for a gangster delighted journalists, who eagerly began to craft the myth of Al Capone. But his reputation, severely tarnished after the Valentine's Day massacre, began casting him in a very negative light. To counter this poor public image, Capone chose to portray himself as a public benefactor, especially by coming to the aid of the poor. Concerned about his image and still very much on the government's radar, as they were determined to dismantle organized crime in Chicago, Capone pulled out all the stops. At that time, his empire generated nearly $120 million in sales per year, equivalent to $1.5 billion today. Money was no longer his primary concern. Capone, therefore, invested his time in trying to restore his tarnished reputation. And he did so by coming to the aid of the poor. Notably during the Great Depression of 1929, when he opened a soup kitchen to help those most in need. For him, it was a way to get closer to the common people and the working class. Above all, his goal was to cultivate a Robin Hood image, stealing from the rich to redistribute to the poor. This supposed philanthropy bought him some time and positive media attention. Though it didn't last long. Legal troubles would indeed catch up with him very quickly. After the Valentine's Day massacre, Al Capone shocked public opinion, particularly with the cold-blooded elimination of Bugs Moran's gang by his men. The incident, widely reported in newspapers, outraged Americans, who no longer viewed Scarface in the same light. Public appearances and humanitarian gestures did nothing to change this. Al Capone had reached the point of no return. The government had made its choice. It wanted to bring down Capone, who instantly became public enemy no. 1. Bringing down the Chicago Godfather, however, was complicated. Capone, at the height of his reign, was so influential that the law itself seemed powerless to touch him. Truth be told, at that time, his army of soldiers was more powerful than the Chicago police and county authorities combined. It was also impossible to bring him to justice for the heinous crimes attributed to him, such as alcohol smuggling, racketeering, pimping, gambling, and most importantly murders. At that time, all of America was convinced Capone was a criminal, yet no one could definitively prove it. Even the highly popular Eliot Ness, a Prohibition enforcement agent at the time, couldn't find the evidence to nail Capone. His team, the Untouchables, later made famous by a movie of the same name, only slightly hampered the gangster's operations. The government and the FBI had no other choice. They had to find another solution. The government, still on its relentless quest to put Capone behind bars, believed the best way was a conviction for tax evasion. Indeed, public enemy no. 1 wasn't paying his taxes, making it a perfectly valid charge for the authorities. Even though Capone was raking in millions, no tax returns were filed in his name. The government spotted a loophole and immediately exploited it. A team of Treasury Department agents was tasked with finding the evidence to bring down the gangster. In 1931, an accountant named Frank J. Wilson finally found it. He uncovered evidence of one of the Godfather's incomes. This income came from a gambling ledger where Al Capone's name appeared. Capone's time was almost up, legal proceedings were imminent. On June 5, 1931, he was indicted for tax fraud. On October 6, 1931, his trial began in federal court in Chicago. The trial took on an international dimension, with media from all over the world covering the unprecedented event. It was the entire United States against a single gangster, unheard of. At this trial, Capone was no more worried than usual. He believed he could get away with a maximum of 2 years in prison if he pleaded guilty before the judges. But as soon as the jurors were selected, Capone, as usual, tried to bribe them. Except it didn't work as expected. The jurors were replaced at the last minute. From that moment on, the trial took a completely different turn. It was after 8 hours of deliberation that the jurors found Capone guilty of tax fraud. 6 days later, the sentence was handed down. The gangster received 11 years in prison. This was an incredibly exaggerated sentence for an era when tax evasion rarely resulted in more than 2 years. Regardless, the endgame was near for Scarface. Prison inevitably became his next destination. Al Capone was thus transferred to the Cook County Jail. His stay there was relatively comfortable and pleasant, thanks in particular to the many contacts he leveraged to his advantage. He had a private cell with a shower, telephone access, and even a way to make remote money transfers. His henchmen and political friends could even visit him whenever he wished. At that moment, everything seemed to be going well for Scarface, who was spending peaceful days in prison. But that was without accounting for the illness that would begin to ravage his mental health. Doctors diagnosed him with syphilis, a sexually transmitted infection likely contracted during encounters with prostitutes in his youth. This disease would cause him to lose much, especially his grip on his criminal empire. Many of his associates would ignore or abandon him at that time. And nothing would get better when he learned of his transfer to the Atlanta Penitentiary, a much stricter prison where no form of corruption was possible. The soft comfort of his previous cell came to an end. At the age of 33, his health continued to deteriorate as syphilis reached its tertiary stage. Consequently, dementia gradually began to affect him. Yet his nightmare wasn't over. In August 1934, he was sent to yet another prison. The federal prison of Alcatraz, a penitentiary island near San Francisco, newly created by the government to contain the country's most dangerous criminals. There, visits were limited to 1 per month. Physical contact with visitors was strictly forbidden. Radio, newspapers, and even reading were not allowed. Working within the prison was a privilege, not a right. Convicted prisoners were isolated in small cells, with no possibility of exchange with other inmates. And to top it all off, there was no way out. So Capone had no choice. He had to continue serving his sentence in this ultra-strict prison. But the disease would bring him out faster than expected. As his condition worsened, doctors were forced to transfer Capone to a hospital. His pitiful state ultimately led him to leave Alcatraz prison for good. Scarface would thus spend his last years at his villa in Florida, surrounded by his family. At that moment, Capone was merely a shadow of his former self. His temperament, akin to that of a 12-year-old child, made him constantly confuse fantasy and reality. On January 25, 1947, Alphonse Gabriel Capone, famously known as Scarface, finally died of a heart attack at the age of 48. Here's a real quote from Scarface: "I came to Chicago with $40 in my pocket. My son is now 12. I am still married and I love my wife dearly. We had to make a living. I was younger than I am now, and I thought I needed more. I didn't believe in prohibiting people from getting the things they wanted. I thought prohibition was an unjust law, and I still do." In his final days, his mind ravaged by disease, Al Capone was known to say things like, "The guy with the binoculars is looking at us, guys." What can we learn from Al Capone's life? Moving from Brooklyn's slums to an opulent gangster lifestyle, he lived his American dream, albeit in a certainly unconventional way. With a considerable fortune estimated at over $1 billion at the height of his reign, he was undoubtedly one of the richest gangsters in history. Obviously, he owed this fortune to the political context of his time. Prohibition, in particular, served as his springboard to develop his criminal empire. While often perceived as the most dangerous and influential gangster in U.S. history, he was, in reality, only truly dominant in his own city, Chicago. To his organized crime counterparts in the rest of the country, he was largely just another mob boss. Which, by the way, was not always seen in a very positive light, as evidenced by his call to order at the Atlantic City Conference following the Valentine's Day massacre. But regardless, in the collective imagination, Scarface is and will remain the quintessential symbol of the 1920s gangster. His cultural legacy continues to be preserved through films, series, and books.